Welcome. This is a particularly delightful occasion for us because we're bringing together colleagues who, well, three of whom are involved in a very extensive project on the Black Sea in the 19th century primarily. And they're trying to do several things. I mean, some of it has to do with the Greek historiography, which is an attempt to look at Greekness and Hellenism and religion in the context of networks rather than nation states, which makes perfect sense because the nation states are not yet in existence for the most part. And this takes all sorts of rethinking and all sorts of backward restructuring of the historiography of Greece itself. And I think this is part of where our colleagues are coming from. Our graduate student from NYU is involved in a similar project looking at the 18th century, trying to understand what it is to be Greek at a time when the term doesn't quite exist yet, and trying to consolidate a sense of a Greek nationhood, which is a constructive project. And I think he's on the heels of many other historians who've been doing something similar. And what this particular project does is, because it's being sponsored in part by the Jordan Center, which is a Russian center at NYU, is to understand the Black Sea and the Mediterranean more generally as a part of imperial crossroads also, imperial networks, Ottoman and Russian in particular, but through which and across which various populations travel. And in this case we're talking about the travel of religious interests, religious pilgrims, military, the navies of Russia in particular, and of course merchants and then local organizations of merchants, again across and transcending the national lines. So all in all, what the project takes is a rethinking of how we understand our basic ethnic categories and trying not to project them backward, which is the first, the prohibition that we're facing. How do you speak about national categories before the nations exist? But related to that is a way to rethink how we can look at different groups as they travel over space and transcend borders. And this is the more challenging part, and this is a group of people who, in my opinion, have done quite a lot to take us in the direction of rethinking and reconceiving the movement of populations and therefore the nationalities and the religions and the navies in question. We're going to, so it's an opportunity for us also to see about the very interesting work that's being done in other places. We're going to follow the following format. We have about 2 hours, and it's a format that worked recently in another event that we put on. To give about half an hour to each of the presenters, let them speak for a bit, have quick back and forth with the audience and with each other, and then move on to the next. And that should give us about 2 hours. It doesn't make for a final conversation, but we don't necessarily need that. This tends to work as well. We'll take it in the order in which it's on the program. Gelina Harlaftis is one of the actually major figures in modern Greek historiography, and has worked on maritime history in particular. And she's going to tell us about her more recent research on the maritime history of the Black Sea and the Eastern and the Mediterranean more generally. Gelina, would you like to sit over there so the camera can get you properly?
Only if I look very beautiful.
You look beautiful always.
I'm not doing that, by the way.
You look beautiful too. You can sit there.
Don't believe you.
So, hello everybody. Thank you very much, Yanni, for this invitation. It is a great opportunity for us to come, and it's really the first presentation of this project, although my weight today has not been just for this project, but to tell you the last 30 years of what I've been doing that led me to this project, and also why I've been looking Greek shipping, maritime history, and how using maritime history as a methodology or as an approach, we have reached the formation of this Black Sea project, as we'll say. So, in this paper I will examine the transport systems in Mediterranean Greeks formed from the 18th to the beginning of the 20th century. And this is the story of the sea trade, at least of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and then integration of their markets in the Western globalizing economy. It is also the story of how the Greeks became the engine of this integration by transforming themselves in the main local carriers of the area, something that led them in the 20th and 21st centuries as was leading nation. Yanni? So this beautiful monster there is 250,000 tons. The father was Phobos, Vasilis Papachristidis and belongs to Vasilis Papachristidis. Well, it shows that in 2000, Greeks under many flags owed the biggest fleets in the world, bigger than Japan, United States, and Germany, and so on, China, and so on. And one of the reasons, Yanni? One of the reasons they reached to this point is because of Black Sea grain. Okay, I've spent 30 years trying to understand why the Greeks are so successful in shipping, and probably only in shipping. But it is not because we are the best and the first and the only ones. But anyway, I'm going to tell you some of the mechanisms they developed. So for parts, I'll start first with my research methodology, then go to how, based on that, we developed some transport systems model, and then from that sprung the entrepreneurial networks in which Greek shipping developed, and today, the current research, the Black Sea Project. My methodology is that of maritime history. I'm not going to go very much into it now, but it is the history of thalassa, sea history. You've heard a lot of Atlantic history. All the histories is sometimes colonial history disguised, but this is very much a lot to do with global history as well. It's a borderless world. It's a disciplinary approach of history with social sciences, including economics, sociology, politics, anthropology, linguistics, and geography. It's a global history, and the main thing is that it's through that it's linking the local, the regional, the national, international. When you approach the activities on the sea without taking under consideration nationalities, then you really understand how people exchanged and communicated, trade cargo communicated. The tools I've used, since I am an economic historian, is the ships, identify ships, the cargoes they carried, the men that handled the ships and cargoes, the ports where they loaded and unloaded cargoes, the maritime community where the captains came from, the economic and social effects of this trade on the places that had merchant fleets, and the places with which cargoes were carried and where cargoes came from. Yes? Don't be lazy. So what I have done all these last 30 years, I've been counting ships. So many thousands of ships. We had to go ship by ship through thousands of documents, and Amphitrite, which has about 50,000 entries, was based on a research program also by European, financed by European Union, and the Greek Ministry of Education. Pondoporia, which has about 20,000 entries, is Greek ships as well. There every 5 years. It was a project financed by the NAFAS Foundation, and Pondoporia 1945, 2000. I'm not going to talk about it more, but it was from 2002 to 2004, and it has another 25,000 ships. This is a Neri there with a veil on a sea Taurus, and we've named these databases according to the some Nereids that are protecting the seamen. So one of them is Amphitrite, another one is Pondoporia. Before I constructed these databases, I had to, there were various methodological problems. Who is Greek? Okay, I'm not going to go into that. We're not beyond identity and culture. It had to do here that Greek, when the captain from Kefalonia went to Malta or Geneva, and he would declare Greco, it meant it was a brand name, profession. It was a proficiency in seafaring. And so if you have in the 18th century, you have Greeks that were Ottoman and Venetian subjects, In the 19th century, there were British, Greek, Ottoman subjects. In the 20th century, there were Greek, Turkish, Italian subjects, and of course there were in all these communities, and so there were Russian, Romanian, French, name it. So what I have gathered is the Greek-owned fleet, ships owned by Greeks under many nationalities, under many flags, but they do have one common thing. It makes sense because they work in the same way. So we'll start with Amphitrite, the first database. That was it was a research group of 20 researchers, and we looked in all these archives from Istanbul to Amsterdam, and we constructed a database of 15,000 voyages in 6 languages. So we have homogenized this in Greek and English. When we started this project, and I was were reading with my good colleague Sofia Laiu, an Ottoman historian, what the Hydriots were writing to the Sublime Porte. Our ships do not only work in the White Sea, but in all seas of the Levant and Ponente, and beyond the Straits in the ocean, in America, in Holland, and in England, in the Baltic Sea. And last year, merchants asked for our ships to be chartered for India. Well, we thought, of course, they're Greeks, they're exaggerating. And they want to show off to the Sublime Porte. But Amphitrite revealed that they were not exaggerating. Amphitrite reveals that more than 400 Ottoman Greek vessels, for example, had traded to the Iberian ports in the late 18th, beginning of 19th. That they were, in the 1790s, they were going down to Montevideo and Buenos Aires, to the Caribbean, and even to North America, and of course, Northern Europe. And of course, thousands of ships after the 1780s go to all the open, newly conquered lands, newly Russian conquered lands, and to Ottoman Black Sea ports. And of course, the beauty of going to many archives is finding the pieces of the puzzle hidden together. So in one of these enormous books of the health authorities of Genova, just there was a loose leaf somewhere there, and suddenly this loose leaf happened to be that, which is a crew list of the brig Achilles with a Russian flag of the Russian merchant of Gil and Sebastopol, Captain Andreas Vokos. Now, Captain Andreas Vokos is our very famous national hero, Andreas Miaulis. To put things in a more in a background, in the framework, what they did were during the 18th century, and particularly after the French Revolution, Greeks. But from the mid-18th century, Greeks took advantage of the Anglo-French competition, and they really became the local seafarers of the Mediterranean. They definitely connected the Levant trade, Eastern Mediterranean and Black Sea trade with the Western Mediterranean and Northern Europe. Greeks developed in shipping by following Western along the Western European countries. Well, they moved cargoes for the Italian cities, for Austrians, for the French, for the Spanish, for the Dutch, and in the East for the Russians. Well, this, you might not be impressed with this, but first of all, I cannot give a presentation without showing you a diagram, and secondly, I was so happy after 4 or 5 years of research to have this diagram. So it shows that at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th, you have really a big rise of Greek-owned shipping. And with Amphitrite, we're able now to have estimates of what was this fleet. And we have this fleet that in the eve of the Greek Revolution, you have about 1,000 merchant vessels. And we are talking about big ships. We're not talking about the coastal vessels that are about 3 times as much in number, okay? We're talking the big deep-sea-going vessels owned by about 40 islands that are fully armed with cannons and seamen and so on. And we can go in every little island and know who has what. So this the second database, which is in the 19th century, that contains about 20,000 registries of sailing ships and steamships. The previous one was voyages. This one is every 5 years, the steamships and sailing ships from 12 sources. We've got a trilogy out. These are the 2 books. On the left it does have printed Pontoporia, where you can find all the families and all the vessels and names and so on. Now, what is the connection with the Pontoporia? Like most of the ships found in Pontoporia, most of these thousands of vessels traveled to Russia and to the Danube. But Russia is really the biggest export area for them. It's the gateways of the Russian cities. And you see this diagram, the second diagram, I'm not going to show you anymore, the exports of grain from southern Russia from 1860s to 1910. And you can see the departures of Greek ships from Russian ports as well. It's really so. Now we're going to the second part, which is the transport systems and how, which really through them you can see how Greeks developed those mechanisms of uniting the various regions in the Mediterranean. It's all about Mediterranean trade. Now, the discussion about Mediterranean has come back with the classic book of Purcell, The Corrupting Sea. It's brought a wave of what's been called the thalassology from 2000 onwards, and they developed Horton and Purcell a model that starts with 2 hypotheses. The one is that there is no unity in the Mediterranean, and the second one is the complete contradiction that there is unity in the Mediterranean. They try to explain this unity by using the concept of microecology, a locality that has, they define this as a locality that has its own identity that is formed from the available productive opportunities. They conclude that the Mediterranean draws its unity and coherence less from the connections of major sea routes, so the city ports, and more from the connectivity of micro-regions. Now, we found that depicted in Amphitrite. So, what happens is, and before I go to explain this, it is Spiros, as has a major Greek historian. His point is the concept of the dispersed maritime city of the Aegean and Ionian seas. And in order to understand how the Greeks developed this, the unit, how they united the various regions, we first make a geographical approach, and we divide the Mediterranean in 3 major regions, and each region in sub-regions. For us, of course, Eastern Mediterranean has 3 regions, sub-regions, so the Northeastern Mediterranean, Southeast Mediterranean, and the Black Sea. And in Amphitrite, we found out that 80% of the cargoes carried by Greeks to the Western European ports came from small loading places, 257. Okay? And they never went to the big ports like Constantinople, Smyrna, Alexandria, or Salonika. Yeah, the Mediterranean maritime regions, yes, we told them. And then in the Northeast Mediterranean, this is the main, it's the districts of the maritime city. the neighborhoods, the synikias of the maritime city, which is composed of 40 islands that developed fleets. But every district, in every district, a transport system was formed. This transport system was consisted of loading places and maritime places. So in every region there was a transport system in which goods were produced in the hinterland, and Greeks were producing these cargoes, and they were circulating them by linking land and sea transport. We must not forget that 18th century is a very big rise of the Orthodox Balkan merchant of the southeastern land transport. Anyway, goods then were produced in the hinterland, and these were exchanged. They were brought down to the loading places, which is the coastal zone. And then maritime centers were formed in the islands nearby, which consist the maritime zone. So the maritime zone, the coastal zone, form a productive system that integrated the markets. Okay? That we can see in the various districts of the maritime city. Okay? So the Ionian, whenever you see an anchor, is a maritime center. Whenever you see a dock, is a loading place. And it was all produced from the inside, either from Peloponnese or from Epirus or from Stereagas that went out to the loading places. And then the fleets developed in these islands. Now, to synchronize and to be competitive, to know in a time when you didn't have any it was only letters, or when would the ship come to these many times deserted places, and not wait for a very long time, and be loaded on time, and leave, and be competitive, is really a miracle. And this is it's not a miracle, it's information, okay? The area really complemented, had everything there. They had, as I say, if we use institutional economics, and economics would be cluster of shipping, which had meaning that it had shipbuilding, it had sales, it had supplies, it had information for freight rates, it had seamen, human resources, it had institutions. I mean, Hydra has this unofficial code of shipping code, which it has regulations of how to do business. Okay, the Ionians the same. They had local codes of conduct for shipping. So, and you see also the Western Mediterranean, the various places where the fleets developed. So, the main characteristic of the transport system is connectivity within the maritime regions, where the sea routes of the foreland, or where ships go, are connected with the land routes of the hinterland, where the cargoes come from, forming thus a dense chain of what we call today intermodal transportation. And you see here what the hinterland means. So this dispersed city had connections with the land routes that went up to India, or up to the Black Sea to Russia, or to Northern Europe. Okay? The second, in the 19th century, these transport systems produced networks that became more formalized, and thus from these regional transport systems of the maritime city, you have entrepreneurial international networks that developed. And these networks never forgot the maritime city, even to the present day, what I call the imagined communities, the ship-owning communities now, the entrepreneurial networks in the 19th century is the dispersed maritime city, where the shipping companies are, who provide low transport, sea transport services to the Greek diaspora trading houses that are established in all the cities from the Black Sea to Northern Europe. I have many years ago made distinguished two phases of this entrepreneurial network. The first one is the 1830s to 1860s, which comprises mainly of 60 families involved in trade and finance, and they are established in the Black Sea, in Odessa mainly, and then in the various Mediterranean cities and in England, which the poles are the Black Sea and England. And from 1860s, 1870s, 1900s, you see that Odessa is not the center, it's the Danube and the Azov, and always London and more companies. So I'm going to finish now with this project, because it is clear that Greek trade and shipping was based on the importance of Black Sea grain exports, and we were very happy to get this project called the Black Sea and Port Cities 1774-1914, development, convergence, and linkages with the global economy. This project has divided the Black Sea in 5 maritime regions. We consider the Black Sea economy, and we want to connect it with the global economic trends and how it fitted. And you have about 20 port cities that are new port cities during from 1780s onwards. And we're dealing with Burgas and Varna in the southwest, Galați, Brăila on the Danube, and Constanța in the northwest, Odessa, Nikolaos, Kherson, who's not there, Fatoria, Sebastopol, Theodosia, Kerch. In the Azov, Berdyansk, Mariupol, Bandarok, Rostov-on-Don, and in the eastern coast, Novorossiysk and Batumi, and in the Turkish coast, Trabzon, Giresun, Samsun, and Sinop, that is not there. The aim of the project is identification, analysis, and synthesis of the economic and social development of these 20 port cities that formed an integrated market and became the larger grain exporting area in the world in the second half of the 19th century until the beginning of the 20th century. In every region, there will be 6 axes of research. First, the Black Sea is a unit of research, the marine environment and the port systems and how they developed until the beginning of the 20th century. During the Soviet and post-Soviet period, this will be a small part. Mainly the research is the long 19th century. Second, the economic and social development of the 20 port cities. Third, the form of the cities, history of architecture and city planning. Fourth, we make macroeconomic statistical series from all the languages of the area, this is the problem of communication there. Fifth, microanalysis, and definitely looking entrepreneurial elites, not only the Greeks, but the Jews and the Armenian business families that really have been controlling the trade of all the cities. And sixth, analysis and linkages of cargoes and passengers to the Mediterranean and the Atlantic. And the last one, as you can see what we're doing a little bit more and how the work progresses by our website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gelina. So this being a session organized by Greeks and Russians, we're behind. Right? Very quickly, if I could ask you, begin with one quick question, which is if you're looking back at the late 18th century and early 19th century, how do you decide if someone is Greek or not Greek? I mean, based on the tonnage and the ownership. I mean, what's happened to Harlaftis? What's happened with?
We don't discuss this.
You don't? Okay.
Well, if you want to say that there's
Albanians, they're Albanians, don't have ships.
But what we discussed, yes, it's true. This is one I get always this question. Well, the Michalis Amados goes to Geneva and says, I am Greco. So I think he's Greco.
I agree.
So.
Okay.
And also, it is a matter of all these are they from Kefalonia or Hydra or Chios or whatever, they follow the same business practices. And for me, this is what is important. Okay?
Yeah.
So this is why I said the identity here is not much at stake, is that they were seafaring, and the Greco was a brand name of proficiency in seafaring.
Language also?
Well, in language, I think they communicated in Greek. Okay, aboard the ship they communicated in Albanian, but with the Kefalonians they communicated in Greek. Okay, so there are many jokes about this in the newly formed Greek state and in the navy. That the ship wouldn't move if they made the orders in Greek.
So this is a wonderful, the richness of this data opens up questions about the Mediterranean that interest me. But because this is a diaspora conference, I'll have a question about the diaspora. So you had that wonderful map which had the circle that defined the Greek maritime.
So you mean can you go back?
Yes.
Yes. The colored one.
Yes.
You go back.
Which were, in fact, there were two different colors.
Back.
That one. Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. So, so this raises fantastically interesting questions about the evolution of the Greek diaspora. And can we suppose from what you're saying that the maritime activities were the basis on which the Greek diaspora developed? And to understand the Greek diaspora, we've got to understand the maritime development? Or could we have had a Greek diaspora in the Mediterranean without the maritime networking? I mean, what's the connection between what we conventionally think of Greek diaspora and what you are doing, which is the maritime networks?
Well, obviously, I was successful since you said the first one. I obviously think it all has to do with the maritime dimension. No, listen, because I mean, if I don't have at all time when we make a workshop or something the next years, we'll show you results that we have done. For example, work with Rura in the Azov port cities. We're having a book out there, and based on Russian archives, we found out that in the 1780s, all the Greeks that were established in Tangarok came from the Ithaca, from Kefalonia, from Sara. They were all ship owners, and they were saying ship owner, sailing ship owner, and so on. So they really went, and many of them sent a relative there, so they would continue doing this trade. I think all of the diaspora communities of the Black Sea, at least, so I'm not going to talk for the other ones, have to do with shipping.
Because my next question was, do Benaki, Salvago, and Choreni need Greek shipping to export the cotton from Alexandria?
Of course they do. Of course they do. But what they do is that they don't have ships of their own. This is what happened. They hire ships from this dispersed city, from the fleet of the dispersed city. This is what they do. And this is low-cost, efficient shipping. And this is one of the comparative advantages.
Yes.
Is also the term diaspora something that we sort of imposed as historians, or is it actually in use at the time? Do people understand themselves as part of a diasporic community, or as a diaspora, or what defined the term?
Well, in the 19th century, or let's say in the second half of the 19th century, certainly. Before what diaspora? I mean, before 1830s, it was all one big unified world. They could the empires, okay? There were no, even what is amazing is that we put the boundaries, but boundaries really mattered after the First World War and the Balkan Wars, because throughout the 19th century, whether it was Ionian under British protectorate, whether it was Greek state, or whether it was the Ottoman Empire, they continued to function the same way they did in the 18th century, without boundaries.
as a follow-up to that, I mean, what I find so impressive about the way all of these projects are reconceptualizing empires in the diasporas is the Ottoman Empire and the Russian Empire in particular become these enormous enabling entities that allow all sorts of things to take place. And one of the things you wrote about in your paper about the implications of their work was that the Ottoman Empire and to some extent the Russian Empire become these incubators for national sentiment, but they provide a certain temporal and geographic stability to allow these things to take place.
Yeah, and in one of the Amphitrite as well has proved that, as I told you in the morning, that Selim III completely, under Selim III, Greeks who were the seafarers of the empire were completely supported by the Ottomans, and it was all this wealth that backfired.
I would like to point out that before we're seduced by these capitalist motivations and shipping explains everything, they're going to the Orthodox world, and they're already creating diaspora communities in that region before shipping becomes important. They're bringing text with them to Holy Russia and translating and so forth, which I'm sure Nikos will tell us about more. But it's not completely linked to maritime activity.
Yes, but you see, I didn't say that everything comes and goes to the sea. I certainly believe that, but I will not tell you that more. But what I say that the massive development happened because of this opening, the conquest of the Russians, and what I said before, what we have found is that before this research, we always knew about the big rise of the land transport of the Balkans and Southeastern Europe. Okay, it was a parallel development of land and sea transport, and this is what is very important. Okay.
Kosti?
Yes, of course, as you said many times, the 18th century is a period of a huge expansion. How do you explain it? And what is, if you have any idea what's happening in the 17th and before?
17th?
Is it zero? Is it?
I started my career with the 20th century, in my 20s, then I wrote a book in my 30s for the 19th century, in my 40s about the 18th century. I'm now feeling young in my 50s. I'm not going to go to school. But what I found, can you go to this lovely diagram? Before. Yes, go on, yes, more.
There are very lovely diagrams.
More.
I'm feeling
This one. No, go on. Yeah. You see that little thing there? Here. This is the trend line. Okay. What does this say?
Is that number of boats?
No, this is number of boats.
Yeah.
Okay. Number of voyages. Okay. And this means that it has come. This was big. 17th century it is. Okay, so according and Molly Green as well has written the importance, and and the fact that we haven't counted 17th century, so we don't know. But this implies that of course it was a rise here. Okay, we had a plunge here because of the wars, and so it goes on. Why 18th century? Because
actually late 18th.
Late 18th?
Yeah,
because it's it's first of all the Industrial Revolution. Okay, in the rest of Europe, you have also the fact that the Napoleonic Wars, it is during that time. So whenever there is wars, you have a lot of demand. Okay, but it is also the economic growth of Western Europe, and Greeks become carriers of these, the Eastern carriers, local carriers of these.
Just increased demand from the West for grain.
Yeah, definitely. From Spain to Spain and Italian cities and Northern Europe. Yeah, great.
And the flag in most of those instances in the latter part are Russian, Ottoman flag.
They are mainly they're based. Yeah, what this database is actually the flag is Ottoman, 80% Ottoman. Yeah, they change flags, of course, but when we find them, it's mainly Ottoman. So it's a myth in Greek historiography that when the blonde race gave us access to Black Sea and the Russian flag, then they became very rich, and there was a great development. No, I mean, it was under the Ottoman Empire and the institutions of the Ottoman Empire. You also have Ottoman ambassadors in Spanish ports, in Portuguese ports, Italian ports, to deal with the problems of the Ottoman subjects in the late 18th century. So it was under having the protection and the institutions of the Ottoman Empire that these flourished.
So it's not the 1770, what is it? Kuchuk.
Yeah, well, it's not. The Kuchuk energy is very important because the Russians conquer those lands. And they cultivate them, they make new cities, they cultivate, the steppes are cultivated because immigrants are being coming. You have from 1790s 300,000 to 5 million in mid-19th century in these areas. So the fact that the lands are conquered by the Russians is really seminal. Okay.
But the shipping was earlier.
The shipping was earlier than that. They had already become important seafarers. Yeah.
So the explosion at the end of the 18th century is not related to the Black Sea. They're carrying for the Western trade, or is the grain?
It is also related to the Black Sea.
So Kichuk looks like it's important thing. It just shoots up.
Yes, but for different reasons, not for the flag. Well, yes.
Not for the flag.
Not for the flag, for the communities and the grain. Okay. They don't use the Russian. It's not the Russian flag that has been important. It's the fact that you have all this Russian grain every year growing, okay, and they being exported. And you have islands like Sara or Idra become deposits. They bring the grain there. You cannot have it outside, and then they bring it back to Malta, Genova, Barcelona, and so on.
One more question.
Yeah, one more question about 1774. You mentioned the Ionian Islanders who make the move over towards the Black Sea. I was just wondering if you knew anything specifically about them in terms of whether or not they had already established networks, or whether or not they were moving there and then established their shipping networks from the Black Sea.
This is a very interesting question. Yes, the Ionians were very important in. It was them that turned. They had a very important fleet. It was the first fleet. All the Greek books of history write about Idra, Spetses, and Sara. Okay, no, that's not true. The first fleet was the Ionian fleet in connection with the central Mediterranean. So when and they really had they really transported for the Italian port cities. When the big with after Orlovica and Kuchuk energy, there was a large number of population that moved. Okay, and from then on the opening of the Black Sea port cities, the Ionians look to the Black Sea, and that becomes their comparative advantage. And you see that the Hydriots never go to the Italian port cities; they go to Genova because it's the monopoly of the Ionian Islands. Then the Ionian Islanders go to the Black Sea. Okay, and that is reinforced with the Russian protectorate, Russo-Ottoman protectorate, in the beginning of the 19th century.
Wonderful. We should move on.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Gelina.
Thank you.
Just for camera purposes, if we could switch places, would that be okay? Thank you. So our next presentation, coming out of, related to the same project, It comes from Evrydiki, who is actually a visiting researcher at NYU this semester. We've been very glad to have her around. And she's been doing actually some striking work rethinking the urban spaces of some of the Black Sea cities in particular Odessa, I think, has been a good part of the research, and rethinking them as terrains of multi-ethnicity and interaction between ethnicities, sometimes peaceful and commercial, and sometimes killing each other. In ways that she's written in interesting ways as well. And she's had quite an effect actually on some of the Jewish historiography about the nature of violence in the 1870s in Odessa. But right now she's going to be telling us a bit about her, well, she'll tell you what it's about, her current project on the city of Odessa.
So this is a project, thank you very much for being here, and it's a great pleasure for me to be here at the NYU and have all these facilities in order to write something scholar, which is a great luxury for people who do research in Greece, I must say, and we are between the very lucky people who can do that. So I will try to, within the framework of the Vasilis project, I'm focusing on Odessa, and my book concerns parts of its history in the 19th century. So I will try to give you some of the results and hypotheses I have made, and we can discuss them. So the project is a peripatetic approach to today's Odessa that reveals snapshots of its life in the 19th century. Odessa's distinctive identity as more of a fin de siècle East Mediterranean port metropolis rather than a provincial city in the Russian Empire was due to two main characteristics: its function as a hub of international trade and travel, and the multi-ethnic character of its inhabitants. Yet, historical narratives usually privilege this or that single ethnic group and present little evidence on the interaction, competition, clashes, collaboration, and common experiences that dotted the activities of Odessans throughout the 19th century. So, let's begin, walk and talk first about the port. In the pre-industrial period, the close connection of the city to the port marked a phase in which the harbour made trade, while in the industrial era, trade made the harbour. The increased size of ships and the need for updated port facilities altered the direct relation between the port and the city and relocated port functions where extensive space was available, thereby gradually cutting the city off from the port. The history of Odessa attests to such a hypothesis. Yet we must keep in mind that the full expansion of its commerce in the Black Sea and the linkage of Odessa to the Mediterranean for either trading or communication purposes was always subject to Ottoman regulations for free maritime transport in and out of the Black Sea. So there's always a political issue which is connected to trade and economics in the region. Next one. Now, Odessa is in the first half of the 19th century was port-oriented. The entire city, with its three initial districts, which are there, it's number, well, the three is Khersonsky, the 4, 6 until the middle is Bulvarny, and 5 and 7, let's say, is Alexandrovsky district. Was surrounded by a semicircular trench that delineated the free trade zone area. The whole city faced the waterfront. The port defined its southern terminus, its window on the outer world, the gateway through which it connected to the global economy. Odessa's port was the interface between the city and the Mediterranean world, which was more readily accessible than the imperial capital. Likewise, Odessa's port was the threshold through which modern ideas on city governance and the way a port city should operate entered the empire. Mediterranean methods for administrating city ports, including the control of sea-transmitted diseases and encouraging the influx of immigrant capital through seafaring and commercial skills, were absorbed by the empire and stimulated Odessa's economy during the first half of its evolution. Although initially important as a naval and coastal port, Odessa's port belongs to the entrepot and free port typology. These ports guaranteed the circulation of goods free of entry duties. Active in Europe, their aim was to promote international re-export commerce. They consisted of a customs outland zone and a free city, an urban unit which was its immediate trading area. Such commercial port cities, privileged by their status, flourished throughout the Mediterranean during the 18th and the early 19th centuries. They had benefited from free trade policies that allowed them to handle a large portion of Europe's maritime trade, accumulate wealth and mercantile expertise, and develop seaborne-related enterprises such as insurance and banking. Next one. The railway now. The railway had an increasing impact on the city's development. It became a second pole towards which the city gravitated, and although it was connected with the port, new suburbs grew around it. The city doubled in size through the incorporation of 3 new suburbs, and ultimately expanded beyond the original free trade zone, which is marked there with a red line. The railway facilitated in-migration flows, industrial development, and the connection of the city to its hinterlands. The port remained a key factor in the city's growth, but not as important as in the first period. While the urban community was predominantly influenced by its port during the first period, in the second half of the 19th century, it outgrew or transcended its port city character. Incoming streams of immigrants from the hinterland, former peasants and Jews, fueled the city's labor force and engaged in domestic service, urban industry, and petty commerce. Odessa, though, stands out as a city with a particular identity, and even more as an atypical Russian city. An abundance of sources, particularly Western travel literature, describes its European aspect in the first decades of its foundation, something that usually faded as a traveler distanced himself from the first city blocks. Yet, some structural factors in the city's process of urban development suggest parallels with the experiences of Mediterranean port cities. First, its governors' efforts to attract population from abroad, not only in the city area, but in the surrounding region as well, led to the settlement of German, Slav, Bulgarian farmers and Greeks from the archipelago and Jews from the Galicia region. The next one. Second, the protagonists of its urban growth and administration during the first decades of its existence were also foreigners, albeit in the service of the Russian crown. Joseph de Ribas, Duke de Richelieu, and his successor, Count Alexander Langeron. Even the Russian native Mikhail Vorontsov, who succeeded Langeron as general governor, had gained a reputation for his British tastes, as he had been brought up in England at the Russian embassy. The ethnic composition of Odessa in 1897 presented some interesting features that differed from St. Petersburg and Moscow's. Slavic languages were spoken by 56% of the population, while religious affiliation indicates that only 55% of its inhabitants were Orthodox. The primary reason for these discrepancies was the high proportion of the Jewish population, about 32%. Next one. The dynamics of economic activity are a major focus of my project, since they help us trace how different ethnic groups engaged in commercial relations and how economic changes affected Odessans. Being the sector par excellence of cross-cultural interaction, trade and related economic activities allow us to detect patterns of ethnic entrepreneurship of incoming immigrant groups. Inter-ethnic entrepreneurial activity and commercial undertakings, such as joint stock companies and banking initiatives, show that the seemingly fragmented along religious and ethnic lines urban landscape of Odessa was in fact driven along class lines. Thus, in my research hitherto, I have discovered that both the upper class, next one, bankers, wealthy merchants, and the lower classes, maids, servants, urban poor, displayed a high degree of integration that sidestepped the religious and ethnic boundaries dictated by state law, religious tradition, and ethnic allegiance. It was mostly the middle class, less wealthy merchants, urban shopkeepers, etc., who competed fiercely in particular sectors of the economy, such as the grain trade, as was the case between the Greeks and Jews. Therefore, it was class that determined whom Odessans shared partnerships or public space with, and whose, the next one, family celebrations they attended. And it was class that allowed Greeks and Jewish women to work together as servants in the same household or as workers in the same factory. The state may have wanted to keep the nationalities of the empire in self-enclosed legal and juridical categories regarding social status and professional opportunities. In Odessa, the urban landscape was fragmented largely along class lines, and to a lesser extent along ethnic and religious lines. Next. A distinctive feature of the city was that its ethnic groups were not confined to restricted areas. Rather, the ethnicities were dispersed among the city's districts based on wealth and how long their families had been settled in the city. Odessa's buildings, streets, and squares were a theater that offered stage and auditorium for reciprocal observation of and exposure to each other's lifestyles and everyday practices, usages, and customs. Much of the city's physical structure offered possibilities for easy coexistence, as individual buildings often hosted households of varying ethnicities. The urban morphology of Odessa permitted porosity and loose ties among its different ethnicities and languages. I borrow this term from Walter Benjamin's Navigation in the City of Naples, in which street and home life interpenetrated. Now the next one. In Odessa, ethnic mixing in some quarters was so pervasive that in the late 19th century, even streets that were named for a specific ethnic group hosted a mix of ethnicities and languages. Let us glance at Evrydiki Ulitsa, the Jewish street, situated in upper middle class Alexandrovsky quarter, which was the city's second district. Now, Alexandrovsky was built right behind the rows of houses of the Boulevardny waterfront area, Alexandrovsky Prospect, along Alexandrovsky Prospect. It hosted private houses and public spaces such as Alexandrovsky Park, the Greek Orthodox Church of the Holy Trinity, and the Great Brody Synagogue, built by Austrian Jews who migrated from the Galician town of Brody. It was also a much sought-after market place for local produce. Let me give you an example of, from the 1897 census sheets. So, on Evrydiki Ulitsa at number 20 stood the Michelson Apartments, the next one, named for a recently deceased Jewish merchant of the Second Guild. The building consisted of 7 apartments. His son Chaim's family lived on the top floor. Chaim and his wife Feiga were educated Russian speakers, born outside Odessa. They had 6 children and 3 servants. A first indication of ethnic and religious boundary crossing was that the family employed 2 live-in Russian Orthodox servants who were entrusted with important duties of cooking meals and attending to the children. The family also rented a room to a Protestant Swiss governess who earned a living teaching French. Another large household with 10 members inhabited apartment 6A. It consisted of a Russian-Jewish couple with 6 children and 2 Orthodox servants. The householder was educated at a commercial school and worked as a clerk in a trading house. On the 2nd floor lived a family of Italian citizens and speakers named Santa, with their newborn child, their elder aunt, and 3 servants. The householder was born in Istanbul and schooled in Braila, Romania. The whole family belonged to the Roman Catholic cult. Signor Caesar Stanta provided the family income as a clerk in a foreign steamship company. On the 1st floor lived a family of German nationality and Lutheran persuasion. The household head, a German speaker, owned a shoe store. His wife was a Russian speaker and they had 6 children. Their extended family included the husband's elderly parents under the same roof. Mechelson's wife, Alka, 59 years old, and the Yiddish speaker, who lived comfortably off rental income, resided on the ground floor. Her domestic situation was a microcosm of the city's social structure, reflecting both its multi-ethnicity and the casualness of its social arrangements. She shared the apartment with her younger son, whose wife was a Polish speaker born in Warsaw. It can be inferred that she had invited a friend of her age from her hometown to live with the family. A widower of Alta's age, but not a relative, also lived in the apartment and served as superintendent of her properties. Alta employed 2 Jewish servants, a cook and a maid, both widows as well. Finally, a Jewish widower with no specific occupation or family relation, but not listed as a renter, was also reported by the census as a resident of Alta's apartment. Is this an indication of the puzzlement of the authorities on how to report non-official relationships, who were run-of-the-mill in Odessa, or even cases of ménage à plusieurs? Some smaller apartments were created by subdividing residences originally of the same size as those on the upper floors to rent more profitably to small householders. They bore, the next one, 4 Russian speakers resided there with no family relation at all among them. Now, in this linguistic and ethnic parallel, families of different origin and language coexisted, became familiar to each other, and observed otherness. After the construction boom of the 1870s, most of Odessa's residential area was covered by apartment buildings occupied by households of various ethnicities. Odessa's residential buildings acted as mediators between the physical structure of the city and the activities of its inhabitants. They formed containers for action in which human subjects left traces, signs of their passing, and clues to their mode of existence. The city was singularly, if unintentionally, designed and built to breed such intermingling. Whether or not this symbiotic pattern could persist under extreme economic and social pressure and intensifying ethnic discrimination neither denies its existence nor minimizes its significance. The port and the city's ethnic plurality were responsible for Odessa's distinctiveness and the creation, the next one, of a particular city identity. If the unifying umbrella of Russianness was a much contested identity in the late 19th century, the self-identification as Odessan citizens transcended social and ethnic boundaries. The city conferred to its inhabitants a sense of uniqueness that all shared regardless of their mutual, exclusive, or complementary identities. The next one. There is no more eloquent way to describe the distinct flavor of Odessa than in Konstantin Faustovsky's words. Odessa, it is the Black Sea, warm wind from the Bosphorus, descendants of Greek smugglers from Piraeus, Italian Garibaldians, captains of dock workers. The riches of all countries, the influence of France, the ghetto of the Moldovanka, gangsters who valued most of all a smart joke, grey-moustached workers from Peresi, Italian opera, the memoirs about Pushkin, acacias, Yellowstone, flowers, love for an anecdote, and enormous curiosity of little things. All of this is of Odessa, but the most important part of it is the sea. Now, I will not let you relax, the next one, with such an idealized description that evokes the nostalgia of the city. Odessa was attractive to some and provincial to other, or even appalling. Vasily Kandinsky, who was born in Moscow and who spent his schooling years in the 1870s in Odessa, gives us the following description. We were forced to go and live in Odessa on account of my father's health. A still small and not over-comfortable city where I went to school. While living there, I could not get over the feeling of being a transient in a strange city, particularly as the spoken language there was surprising and often downright incomprehensible to us. The homesickness for Moscow never left us, and it was with the greatest joy that I used to go with my father to Moscow. As Kandinsky's first ethnographic paintings reveal, he was mostly attracted by the colorful folk art of the inner Russia, and Odessa remained to him an unknown and strange city. Therefore, these are some of the affirmations and contradictions that spread out before me, and I'm challenged to resolve them with my research.
So, Ruda, fundamentally, part of what you're referring to is you're saying that as we reach back in time and we look at the 19th century or the early, up until 1905 or so, and we try to insist on finding one or another ethnic story in isolation by itself, within Odessa in this case, it's actually ahistorical and doesn't quite make sense in certain regards. Which is to say that we need an alternative way of understanding it as a landscape, which involves movement and interaction and networks that might not be detected if we're looking at only one ethnicity. So, for example, if I were to go and say I want to find out about Greeks of Odessa, it's necessarily not going to work as a plausible historical narration. Would that be about right?
Yes. There is a great problem because during this 19th century, both, let's take two groups, the Jews and the Greeks. There is a very strong assimilation process in both communities. And this is very clearly seen in the 1897 census, where we can see that the Russian speakers in the Greek community and the Russian speakers in the Jewish community are nearly half the population. So there is, at least until the 1870s, where before the pogroms and this difficult situation, there is a lot of interaction, intermingling, cooperation, and at least my point of view, from what I see until now, is that in the upper classes and the lower classes, this is very evident. Where we have a lot of competition is in the middle classes, and as you know, there is this great discussion about Russia's lack of middle class. Exactly, in Odessa, this middle class, it's the minorities that provide the middle class in Odessa. So it's mostly the Jewish part of the population, the Greeks, and other small groups. So I would say that until the 1870s we have a lot of interconnection and breeding and new forms of sociability, and the difficulty in the interethnic relations occurs in a period of great economic recession, and in a period in which, while this recession continues, we have a continuous flow of Jewish population in the city. So Jews who were seen at least as very useful people for the development of the city, they become a burden that the city cannot handle and cannot incorporate and assimilate. So I think this is one of the reasons. Of course, there are a lot of other reasons that have led to the clashes we know, and another very important reason is the fragmentation of the labor force along ethnic lines. So we have trade unions before, the associations we have before trade unions were permitted to exist, they are along ethnic lines, and this is something that does not create a unified labor movement in the city, and this facilitates the conflict between the communities, even among the poor.
And those conflicts are centered, as you're saying, in those middle groups. Are we talking about like Mishenya, Second Guild, merchants, that kind of, those groupings?
Yes, I would say that they focus on the Meshane for sure, and the second guild merchants. The first guild merchants, they think that they collaborate very well. I mean, they would a prominent Russian merchant of the first guild, he would hire a Jew lawyer in order to resolve his conflicts, and he would work in the same committee or board of industry or I don't know what, with the Greeks and the Russians. So there is no problem there. The problem is in the lower middle class, and I think as we are approaching 1905, in the working class as well. And there, the great problem is that, for example, we have the industrial workers are mainly Russian. The people who work in the garment industry and the small workshops, they also belong to the working class, but they are Jews. So we have different unions that organize them. We have different political influence on these groups, and it's very easy for them to, when there is a crisis, when there is no work on the port, when there are no jobs, when the situation is, we are in a situation of depression, then it's very easy to turn the one against the other.
Yanni, something similar happens in Salonika with the upper class.
In
the 1870s, right?
Yeah.
Where the metropolitan, the imam, and the chief rabbi, within 1 week, they all put out edicts that said you cannot celebrate New Year's with people from other religions. So you basically, because why? The upper class basically celebrating all together. And so the religious leaders are losing status and authority out of that. Similar things seem to be happening in Odessa at about the same
In
time.
Marseille,
In Marseille, yeah.
It reminds me also of the other case from Salonika, which is that in the process of trying to consolidate people as in national and religious groups, they set the preconditions for the conflict. I mean, simply because they've organized themselves and had been organized by their church leaders, by the business leaders, as the case may be, schools, they've been organized into separate groups, partly in order actually to recognize and protect separate interests, and in the process set the preconditions for communal violence, right? Because they've separated themselves and identified themselves differently now, and losing that sort of mixed cosmopolitan imperial identity. Nadia?
What kinds of violence are we talking about? I mean, beating people up, breaking shops, I'm just curious.
Well, it seems that there is a common pattern in this, in these so-called pogroms. There's 3 days violence in the streets by unidentified groups who, at least from the police reports, it seems that most of them are not even citizens of the city. They are this permanent incoming population that brings, let's say, the wheat, and they either sleep outdoors or they go back in the evening to their village. So there is all this, so this accelerates. The authorities, they go to certain places where they know that there is Jewish population. They begin to break windows and destroy property, and we might even, the third day, depends on what the police is going to do, if they're going to intervene or not. Usually they don't, or they intervene when it's already very late. And we have people killed and murdered as well. So usually it's a 3-day process as it has occurred.
Is it regular, or we're talking about?
Well, no, it's not regular, but it has happened in the 19th century. Let's begin. It has happened in 18. It has happened when they brought the body of the Patriarch from Istanbul after the Greek Revolution, and they wanted to bury him in Odessa. So it began as a conflict between Jews and Christians, and of course there is a history behind that. I mean, that the history is that the Jewish population had a different perception of the Ottoman rulers than what the Greek population had. So they transport their conflict from the Ottoman Empire to Odessa. This is one case. Then we have in 1859, again during the Easter holidays, in 1871, outside the Greek church, which by that time is in a neighborhood which is completely Jewish now. So there are opportunities of this kind of conflict, and then 1881 and 1905, and I think that was the last one. Was the most difficult case they had to confront.
Odessa of the first half of the 19th century is different from the Odessa of the second half of the 19th century, or am I not right? I mean, the composition is different, no?
Well, it becomes slow, gradually, predominantly. The Jewish population increases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is what I mean.
Much more
the first half is more.
Yeah.
It's only 1/3, right? But it is very vibrant, from the economic life of the city.
May I propose that we take 5 minutes, which to all of you will mean 10 minutes of break, and then come back? Would that be all right? We'll go a little late, but we're okay. Thank you. Bye. We've been moving from the very distant area.
From the suburbs.
From Connecticut. From Connecticut. And Nikolaos, as you all know, has been somebody who's been studying very carefully the religious networks, religious questions in the Russian Empire, and spilling recently into the Mediterranean, and now with the pilgrimage routes. And he's been one of the people who's been reminding us that there's also a religious dimension to the population movements and to the questions of self-representation that we've all been dealing with. And this, I gather, Nico, is from your most recent research. Is that right?
Yes, it is.
So tell us about it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, first of all, to the organizers. Thank you, Yanni. Thank you to the Jordan Center. Thank you all for coming, friends and colleagues here this afternoon. I would like first to point out that my PowerPoint presentation is not going to be as elaborate as the ones of the two ladies before me, but I would like to point out that the blue color of mine with the wavy part of it at the top is much nicer than either of them. And it's sort of a tribute to the Mediterranean, I guess, which is part of our Mediterranean as movement, so you can take that as movement along the Mediterranean, what Homer used to call the wine dark sea, I guess. Right? Now, I'm very interested myself, not in economic history or maritime stuff, but I'm very interested in religious/cultural history of the traditional, shall we say, mode or fashion. If anyone is interested in what exactly I mean by that, I can tell you after the talk. One of the things that I am going to do today is I'm going to take our title a little bit more literally, shall we say, as a contest, the Mediterranean as a contested space. And one of the things I think that the work that Rura and Gelina are doing and all of us are doing in the broader project in which we are working is sort of show the connections, some forms of unity that existed, right, because of economic activity, exchange, trade. But within that unity there were also what I like to call fissures or sort of problems. There were also cleavages, there were rifts, there were conflicts. So one aspect of those conflicts is the sort of Greek-Russian conflict over what you would call control of Orthodox spaces, shall we say. The Orthodox spaces that I have in mind are, first of all, Jerusalem, the Orthodox, right, shrines that is in Jerusalem, and then what I'm going to talk about today, Mount Athos. However, the story that we're going to hear today takes place in Odessa. And it takes place in Odessa because that's where I did most of my work for this particular sort of project. And what I'm interested in is the business of pilgrimage. And what I mean by business in this case, if you want to go to the next one, Yanni, please, is the logistics of pilgrimage. Again, not the economic part so much as the issuance of travel documents, accommodation of pilgrims, and what roles the civil and religious authorities in Odessa played in the processing of pilgrims. So I'm interested myself in how someone from the Russian Empire, primarily an Orthodox subject, right, of the Tsar, what he or she had to do in order to get to the Holy Land, right? But I'm not going to get them to the Holy Land today. I'm going to keep them in Odessa. So the story is the Odessa part of this wider movement, if you wish. It's the Odessa pilgrim experience. The argument that I'm making, and which I call the Athonization from Mount Athos, Athonization of pilgrimage, or at least the Odessa pilgrim experience, falls squarely or focuses squarely on the role that was played by the three patvoria, which is the dependencies, if you wish, of monastic, of Russian monastic establishments in Mount Athos, or on Mount Athos. These three Russian monastic establishments were the monastery of St. Panteleimon, and then two skids, the skid of St. Andrew and the skid of Prophet Elijah. So, and what I wanted to find out is, first of all, who helped people get documents to leave Russia, passports, let's say. Where did the pilgrims or future pilgrims live in Odessa when they came there in order to board a boat and get to the Holy Land? What did they eat? Where did they sleep? What did they do? So I was interested in the Odessa experience. And what I found out was that primarily this Odessa experience was in fact an Athonite one. What I mean by Athonite here is that it is conditioned, controlled, its parameters are set by, at the local level, monks from Mount Athos's Russian monastic establishments. Now, before, however, we get to how exactly they did that, I should say that my work focuses on the 1880s and 90s, and that's the period in which there is a more organized, shall we say, from the center, from the imperial center, attempt to promote pilgrimage. This organized effort is associated with the creation of the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, the IPO, IPPO, right? This was a private entity, and its stated aims were to basically support Orthodoxy in the Holy Land, to promote scholarly study of it, and to help pilgrims from Russia get accommodation and get there and actually see it or experience it. So what then this organization, the Imperial Orthodox Palestine Society, which was not imperial for 7 years but became imperial in 1889, it was primarily deal with what you see up there. They tried to streamline, if you wish, already existing processes, right? And to fix them wherever they saw a problem. So, for example, they published pilgrim or issued pilgrims booklets which had coupons for travel, right? And they gave ticket discounts, they published guides for the pilgrims, and they also took care of the accommodation and processing in Odessa and in Jerusalem. That accommodation and processing in Odessa, was in fact done by the Patvoria. And here what we see is a sort of, not so much a kind of formal agreement, but rather a kind of fusion where already existing sort of work that is being done by the Patvoria, the IPO looks at it and says, well, this works, that doesn't, let's fix this part that doesn't, and let's let the monks do the job for us. So in essence, the IPO, which is in other ways very controlling, very bossy when it comes down to sort of, organizing this thing, they are very happy to let the monks of Mount Athos Russian monasteries do the job in Odessa. So what they do, they house the pilgrims in their own buildings. And as we shall see, these sort of Patvoria buildings, the hostels, the dormitories, officially supposedly opened up in the early 1880s, but unofficially they had existed at least 10 or 15 years before that. We shall see one case in a moment. they help pilgrims formulate paperwork, because a pilgrim comes to Odessa. Most of them were peasants, by the way. So what the monks would do with them, when they would arrive at the train station or at the port, the monks would go there, take them by the hand, divide them among themselves in the 3 different monastic communities, and then tell them, okay, I'm going to get the paperwork done for your foreign passport. I'm going to get you a Turkish visa. And by the way, I also have room and board for you in my monastery. Okay? Now, supposedly this is done for free. But in reality, it's very clear from all other evidence that we have that some sort of voluntary payment is sort of expected. It's like the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it is recommended, not suggested, as you know lately, this big scandal that has sort of exploded over there. That is the one thing that they do, the administrative formalities. The other thing that they do is what I call the shielding of pilgrims from Odessa's secular allures, which I like very much this way. If you look at the memoirs of pilgrims, and grand memoirs are, memoirs of pilgrims. I mean, you're not going to hear about the bars and the cabarets of Odessa writing them, but if you look at them, and again and again and again, what you see is this sense that Odessa is this sort of weird, unknown place which is very much full of the sort of criminal element, right? And so what they need is some sort of shielding, right? Some sort of support, protection. The Padvoria give them that. Because, and you shall see, one of the most, so we say, majestic Padvoria there is the St. Panteleimon one, which on the first floor has stores, on the second floor has dormitory, on the third floor has the church. So all your needs are basically, covered. Right? I mean, remember that. They pick you up at the train station, which is across the square from this Padvoria. They bring you there, they feed you, house you, take care of your spiritual, needs, and then they put you on the boat and send you to Jerusalem. In some ways, pilgrimage starts way before, you board them the boat. So, the spiritual Athonization, the logistical Athonization that I'm talking about here is actually sort of precisely that. The processing of the pilgrims, and something that I can say much less about, despite being me, the spiritual Athonization, which, sort of, how do I measure the spiritual life of someone? Nadia is going to help me on that, she promised. But Yanni, you want to sort of go next. Now, here is the Panteleimonos Padvoria. I mean, literally, it's across the square from the train station in Odessa. Over 95% of pilgrims from the Russian Empire in the last 2 decades of the 19th century arrived in Odessa by train. Okay? So, I mean, literally, you are waiting for them across the square. Right next to it is the St. Andrew, and around the corner is the Prophet Elijah. Okay? Padvoria. So, literally, the monks are over there waiting for you. So, this is the one aspect. Right? Then, shall we say, let's help the pilgrimage aspect. Then there is the other interesting aspect of this, where the contest, if you wish, that I started with comes up. And this is something that just literally I came across because of Rura, who in Odessa photographed a file, and she said, I have something for you about one of these Padvoria, I'm going to send it to you. And lo and behold, it's a big scandal in 1882-83. What happens? Very briefly, there is a police case. There is a raid, apparently following a 6-month surveillance. The police raids what appears to be a big complex of buildings housing this Padvoria, this dependency, which appears in quotation marks in the file documents, right? What do they find out there? What they find out, first of all, is that the owner of the house is the brother of Archimandrite Makarios Suskin, who is the hegumen, the abbot of the St. Panteleimon monastery of Mount Athos. They come from a very famous Tula merchant family that dominates, St. Petersburg trade for about a quarter of a century. People who work in the Padvoria are pretty much all of them retired military personnel. And apparently they also find huge storage areas where they find tens of thousands of paper items, 4 different kinds of oil, branded Athonite, but made in Odessa, or made in Taiwan, whatever. Eventually, this sort of like, the police basically take this stuff. They also find out that there is lots of correspondence in which there is hundreds of thousands of rubles that have been sent via the Padvoria to the monastery on Mount Athos, but very clearly in a clandestine manner. So the authorities do not know about that. So what do? They basically take them all, they take them to jail, and then a crisis management case begins, where the Hieromonk Pavel, who is in Moscow at the time, immediately comes down to Odessa. He is the sort of head, right, of the Padvoria, and writes to Odessa's temporary governor, a veteran of the Russo-Turkish War, Gurko, whose son later on is the assistant minister of the interior in Nikolaos II's government, and more or less tell him that this is a case of professional jealousy of our competitors, the hotel owners, the Jews, who basically dislike the fact that we offer free accommodation to the pilgrims, and therefore they are very much against us. And let me tell you, by the way, what the monastery has done for the Russian patriotic cause. And what follows is 3 pages, densely written prose, in which, the monastery on Mount Athos is called Russian St. Panteleimon Monastery, made up only of sort of Russian monks, no Greeks there. We have helped the war effort of Russia. We are working for Russian Orthodox. It's all Russian causes. Okay, and of course, predictably or less predictably, it depends. What we find out later on is that the case is closed, the people are freed, and within the same week, the monastery officially applies to open up a dependency, a Padvoria, now officially for pilgrims. In other words, what we have here is what? We have a situation in which the monasteries on Mount Athos, which at the time are sort of, the Russian monasteries are waging literally a war for establishing themselves right on Mount Athos, are basically using money, funneling money from Odessa to the mother monasteries on Mount Athos through the processing of pilgrims' business. That's the sort of image that I'm getting here. And so we have the multifaceted and in parts contested, right, sort of activity, if you wish, of the monasteries. The monasteries are conduits of Russian religious influence, obviously. They are conduits of Russian political influence, or so they like to think, but so does seem to think Papadonosov, for example, who really sort of reins in the monks in some of their wildest schemes, shall we say, but he has absolutely no problem supporting them whenever he thinks it's helpful. And then there is Russian economic activity that is involved there as well. And this is taking place in a sort of the guise of a patriotic enterprise. The contest, of course, here is about holy places, holy shrine, Mount Athos, for example. And I can talk to you more about that. But I guess what Jan, if you want to go to the next one, what I'm interested myself, I guess, is the several multifaceted aspects of monastic activity as expressed in the Padvoria in Odessa. I mean, my interest is pilgrimage, you guys, okay? That's what I'm interested in. And sort of I came across this other aspect of the pilgrimage process, which the cynical me that I was not surprised, but on the other hand, this is something that I was not planning to work on. I was planning to work on the spiritual aspect of it. But apparently, I'm going to have to go into the other aspect of it. So what are the Athonite Padvoria doing as a conclusion? They are controlling or trying to control pilgrimage. They are chaperones of the Tjomnibiezat Vietni Yud. I love this expression. This is the secretary, in fact, of the IPO, who basically says that, this is the dark, sort of irresponsible or unable to speak for itself, mass of people, and so we have to take care of them. Right? The peasant pilgrims. They are middlemen between the pilgrim and the civil authorities. Why? Because instead of the peasant going to the sort of clerk and says, give me my passport, they do it for them, for a fee. They are economic agents of mother monasteries on Mount Athos. Unofficial? I'm not sure. Maybe they are official, maybe they are unofficial. Promoters of Russian interest in the Eastern Mediterranean. So, I guess what I'm getting out of this thing myself is two things. One of them is there is unity in the Mediterranean in economic activities, but there is contest too. There is rift, there is sort of problems there. And lo and behold, whenever there are clergymen there, there is problems. Yeah. Secondly, there is a multifaceted history of pilgrimage. There is the spiritual aspect of it, there is the ritual aspect of it, there is the economic aspect of it. There is the multifaceted history of pilgrimage. Thank you very much for your attention.
As we see it continuously now, the Athos, as we see it continuously now.
Oh my God, is it continuing now? Ever since Putin went there, there's tons of money that is going in. But you realize that the Greeks, what they are doing, everyone who goes to Mount Athos automatically, become a monk, automatically gets Greek citizenship. This is part of the original sort of katastatikos chartis. Well, the Greeks are refusing to give them, right? And therefore they cannot live there. There are about 50, I think, now officially Russian monks, and about 250 probably FSB agents,
No, but it's the same from Russia, Greece, there, and the Athos continues. Thank you.
But
Thank you.
I have a question.
Please.
Mari.
How interested are the managers of the Metochia, the Vodi, how interested are they in getting pilgrims to go to Mount Athos as well as Jerusalem?
Very much.
Okay.
Actually, this is something that I did not talk about, but one of the reasons that I think they are very interested in doing that is because they are interested in sort of firmly establishing Mount Athos or giving it a prominent place in the what you would call the pilgrimage geography of the Russian people. So for men obviously only, because women cannot go there, but it's interesting that there is also a network of communication, right, with the women, to whom some of whom they are ispovedniki, right, and what they do to these women is they say, okay, I would like you to sort of knit for us or to make for us, the curtains for the holy doors, or I would like you to sort of the plasanica, right? The sort of epitaphios, sort of cloth that we use. So there is an interest there to cultivate both male interest and visits and female interest, and there are wonderful occasions. Nadia, you and I have to write something about that, by the way. There are wonderful occasions of rich women who take one of those sort of, what would be in a sort of a hyperbolic manner called yachts, that go by the coast of Mount Athos, and then you cannot even dock the boat, right, if there are women on it. So you have to stay away, and because their sons are there, their nephews are there, and in fact there are, Makari Shuskin brings out some of the most holy icons from the monastery to the boat for the women. Okay? So it's not just Serbian princesses that did that, it was also Russian rich women.
Now, my question is that, is the church afraid of the dangers of the sinful city? I mean, because
for Odessa?
because you might, from what I understand, you get there, you might need at least 10 days to get your passport, and when you leave on the boat, you haven't seen the city. So you're just in the monastery, you go to church, and you can buy the things you need. So, but do we have any manifestations or writings or that what's happening in this from the church point of view.
From the church point of view itself, from the local church, that's one of the things that I have found so far, and I stress so far, they are not figuring anywhere in this business. This business is run by the Athenites, right? So the Archbishop of Odessa, yeah, there is a rundown old hostel that can house 60 pilgrims, but they mention it in the 70s, they forget about it in the 80s, really. So we don't hear from them about, keep these people shielded. They don't say that in particular. Where I find that thing is directly in some of the publications of the IPO, where they say literally we need to protect these sort of unsuspecting, people from the swindlers of Odessa. They say that. Indirectly, I also see it in the guides that they put out. And the guides actually, and by the way, the Padvoria also put out guides of their own. They devote so little time on Odessa that it's sort of indicative that they are not interested in promoting the city. I mean, Kiev has 60 pages, right, with the Sviatini, with the shrines of Kiev. In one of the guides, Odessa has 10 pages, 8 of which has to do with administrative formalities. I mean, they don't say, oh, by the way, there is like Church X and Church Y there, go visit it. It's very clear that there is some kind of segregation, should I say that word? They try to segregate them from the city itself. I mean, Kalinin memoir, Kalinin is a guy, a teacher, and part of this paper actually focuses on that. Kalinин's memoirs of 1895, and granted, Kalinin is not a peasant, right? I mean, he's not the Tioni Bjezadvietny Lud, right? Or a member of it. Kalinин's memoirs, Kalinin spent 5 days in Odessa. The only thing that he says about it is one line. When he's sort of approaching it by boat, he says, oh, it looks like a beautiful city. And then he goes on to describe to you the icons, their painting styles, the churches of the Padvoria or whatever, and there is nothing about the city itself. So my sort of impression, therefore, is that they are afraid. And given the fact that we have all these works like Rosanas and other people, Lywood, I think, from Berkeley, who talks about the myth of Odessa as a, this city, of swashbuckling, criminals.
Which is a nice fantasy. I mean,
yeah. Oh, maybe it's a total fantasy, but that's the way they are looking at it. I mean.
There's hardly any mention of it in the Muslim pilgrimage accounts either.
They don't talk about it either.
They go through Odessa, they get through as quickly as they can, and then they leave.
Because in a couple of the files, actually, there were some issues with where they were staying, the Muslim pilgrims. I will give them to you, and you can see, because they were thinking that that it was not particularly well kept, shall we say. But that was already after 1905, I think.
Where are they coming from?
The pilgrims that I study, because we actually work on very similar things. We just met today, but they're coming from Russian and Chinese Turkestan. So they're taking new Russian railroads, going to Odessa, then sailing to Istanbul, and then going southward and joining pilgrimage caravans and going to the Hajj, to Mecca.
And there is a magnificent case, 1871 or 72, where the Russian ambassador in Istanbul sends a letter to the governor of Odessa, and he says, just today, about 2,000 Tatars unloaded, fully armed, on the quay in Istanbul. What the hell is going on with you people? Why did you let them go? So the Turkish authorities get really very upset about that. So what they do is they go to the Russian ambassador and they say, hello, and so they put them back in and again send them back,
But I understand, but this is kind of a trope, though. Only visit Vietnamese Lud. I don't think Odessa is special. If you look at the records from Bari, where they all want to go because it's St. Nicholas, it's exactly the same thing.
It is, huh?
So only visit Vietnamese Lud, they're being exploited by the people, they need our guidance. So, I mean, I don't want to make it seem as if Odessa isn't special. Odessa is special.
So you think it's for an internal pilgrimage too, Nadia?
You see exactly the same
for Bari,
in Bari and Ancona.
But it would be interesting because, Christine Warwitz and Chris Churros have studied the internal sort of pilgrimage, and what they found is that the authorities are very worried about disorder. What later on is going to be Nikulturnas, right, palomničestva, the non-culture aspect of the pilgrimage. But Bari said they had the same thing.
And it's not the sneaky Jews, it's the sneaky Italians.
The sneaky Italians,
right?
Yeah.
Our simple
well, in
people.
Jerusalem, it's the sneaky Greeks, by the way. They say that, yes.
I'd like to make two more
yes.
like bibliographical
yes.
comments. First of all, thank you once again for your wonderful presentation, which we always all enjoy. And this is a subject
what about the
dear to our house.
What about the
have you come across this book by Stephen Graham called
yes,
With the Russian Pilgrims,
yes.
which gives one of the more vivid descriptions.
Yes.
And it reminds me of Professor Harlaftis' work because it's all about chleb. You know, nothing but chorny chleb, moldy, that they have in their pouch for whatever, a 2-month journey. And then there are two Russian scholars working on this project you probably already know about. Laura Gerd, who deals with the Podvoria in Jerusalem and Haifa, right? And she's just published 2 books on Athos and
one of which is actually 2 chapters from the previous book.
Exactly. Yeah. And then Nikolai Lisovoy from Indrek, they both have about 5 or 6 books between 2010 and 2012 on the topic. And they use consular reports to describe what happens when the pilgrims get off the ship, of course, and go and have the same sort of barracks type of setting, only this time in Jerusalem. You know, it's an amazing story. But I look forward to the reading more about your nitty-gritty aspects of these, you know, Ludi getting on board a trip, because we always see about icon painting and so on, but not about what do they do to wash themselves or something?
The problem with this sort of bibliography that you talked about, the historiography, is that I was telling Gani downstairs, is Savoy has done an excellent job bringing together new documents, publishing them and so on.
Right.
However, the interpretive framework is the one that was set by the IPO itself. In 1907 by Nikolaos.
Oh, sure.
They say, well, such a great organization, we've done such great things, so it's like as if between 1917 and 1991 nothing happened.
There's a tinge of Russian nationalism and messianism. And,
they're talking about Russia's mission.
Yeah, absolutely. But the documents are getting explored.
They're bringing out Dostoevsky and they're talking about the universal empathy, of the Russian soul. And that's when I close the book myself and I go next.
Well,
unless there's a
guide to your research.
Great. One more.
Yeah, just to bring you down into the very exciting economic aspect.
Why are you here?
Well, we managed to meet between pilgrimage and the sea. You see, this is this were travel agents, okay? These were good travel agents.
Remember, my father was one, my brother is.
Yes. Now, it's very interesting, I think, if you would to see what steamship lines they used, okay, and if they also got some commission, because good travel agents always took commission. Again, what kind of tickets and prices of tickets, and that would be very actually.
Okay, sure, absolutely.
That's probably part of the reason why they don't want them to spend much time in Odessa. They're probably charging them much more for tickets and whatnot if their money is going back to the monastery, and they don't want them to realize possibly. That could be part of the reason.
Yeah, absolutely.
That is the case in Bari.
Yeah.
By the way.
That's the case in Bari.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Yes.
We really should move on. Did you know that? Do you know that Latsis made his big money by taking Muslim pilgrims from around the world, in South Asia in particular, to Mecca, right? Using Liberty ships.
I will tell him the secrets of my profession later.
This is getting interesting. This is getting interesting.
Writing a book on the Liberty ships.
Yeah. Nico, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And at last we come closer to home, which is to one of our own PhD students who's writing right now a history of the Orlov rebellion and the Orlov conspiracy, whatever we want to call it, among people who we know to be Russians and others whom we suspect to be Greek. And as I understand it, you're giving us an excerpt of one of your chapters, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a chapter from my dissertation's 3rd chapter. It deals with the Orlov conspiracy. It's an extended chapter, so I tried to cut it down and focus on 2 primary sources. But the topic of my dissertation, for those who don't know, is this shift that occurs from a religious understanding of Greekness to a national understanding of Greekness that begins in the middle part of the 18th century. It takes about 100 to 150 years, depending on how you understand the question. And the question that I pose in my work is what initiated this shift. So my approach is a bit different from what you see in the traditional Greek historiography.
So rather than examining this change over the longue durée, over the 150 years, as other Greek historians have done, the dissertation considers the impact of this one specific event, this Orlov revolt of 1770. For those of you who don't know, the Orlov revolt was a Greek uprising in the Peloponnese against the Ottomans that was organized by Russians who were working mainly out of the Italian states. And so it's very Mediterranean, very international. So the focus of this paper is the negotiation of Greek identity that goes on in these two particular topics, these two particular documents that I'm looking at. So the presentation will consider how the Russians presented the revolt that they were trying to foment. It considers it from these two vantage points. The first is in 1765, during the exploratory stage of the revolt, when a Greek-born Russian artillery officer by the name of Yorgos Papazolis published a military manual for Greeks. The Didaskalia, or teaching, contained an extensive prologue and introduction explaining why the Greeks should rebel against the Ottomans, and 10 or so chapters that detailed military tactics, how to organize armed groups, etc. The second document that I'm going to be describing was authored in 1769 by Catherine the Great. It was a proclamation that was directed towards Orthodox Christians living in the Ottoman Empire, in which she encourages them to revolt, which comes to be circulated in the beginning of 1770 when Theodore Orlov arrives with the first part of the Russian fleet. I'm going to be advancing two related arguments. The first is that the Russians perceived the uprising as one that would be limited to the Ottoman Balkans, in which the goal was for the Orthodox Christian communities of the region to liberate themselves from Ottoman rule by fighting alongside the Russians. So it was not a war against Islam, and it was not a war that would implicate Orthodox Christians living in Venice, living in the Habsburg Empire, and elsewhere. Second, in advancing this message, the Russians were essentially communicating a new political understanding of Greekness, which regarded the Greeks as political agents capable of determining their own political status, which was a fundamentally new idea in the Greek world. So some background on the origins of the revolt and on Papazolis. The idea essentially came from Yorgos Papazolis, who was born in Siatista in present-day Macedonia. At that point, Siatista had established extensive overland trade ties within Central Europe, in Vienna and Hungary, and parts of Russia as well, to which they transported raw material surpluses, so wood, cheese, skins, and some craft products as well. In his early years, he tried his hand as a merchant trader. He worked in Thessaloniki, and he worked as far afield as the Crimea. Ultimately, he failed. He went into the Russian service, where he met the Orlov brothers as an artillery officer. He assisted with Catherine's coup d'état, and then had an indirect channel to Catherine influencing her foreign policy in the region. So after the coup d'état, Gregory, in particular, proved very enthusiastic to pursue this endeavor, but Nikita Panin and some other advisors didn't share this enthusiasm. And so Grigory and Papazolis decided to pursue the endeavor through more clandestine channels. So what ended up happening was Grigory Orlov commissioned Papazolis, Emmanuel Saros, a Greek merchant who operated within St. Petersburg, and Vasilis Tamaras, a translator originally from the Ukraine, who was also in the Russian employ, to undertake this clandestine mission into the Ottoman Balkans. So in Orlov's capacity as quartermaster of the artillery, he secured 3-year leaves for the three, and then funded the exploratory mission personally. The three emissaries were specifically tasked with gauging how receptive the Orthodox Christian inhabitants of the region were to rebelling against the Ottomans. Saros traveled extensively through Rumeli and the Peloponnese between 1763 and 1764, establishing contacts with various powerful figures in Mani and Kalamata. Upon his return in 1765, he reported that there was a strong willingness to revolt among the Orthodox Christians, and proposed sending a small fleet of 10 warships or so, with sufficient cannon to the Mediterranean. Likewise, Tamaras suggested that the Russians could smuggle arms and munitions into Ottoman Europe fairly easily through various Italian ports, as ships were rarely inspected by the authorities in the ports. He estimated that 150,000 francs entrusted in the right hands would be sufficient to inspire a widespread revolt. while Saros and Tamnos played important roles in the exploratory stage of the conspiracy, it was Papazolis who went above and beyond in forging ties with influential Greeks. Stationed in Trieste, he was able to foster connections with influential families from the Peloponnese. Throughout this period, the former artillery officer also conducted extensive trips throughout Ottoman Europe, traveling under various pseudonyms, and through his efforts he was able to inspire individuals and communities in Epirus, Rumeli, and Peloponnese to commit to the conspiracy. So turning now to the Didaskalia, the document that he wrote in 1765. It was initially published in 1765, and while it's a monograph that deals mainly with military practice, it's the prologue and the introduction that are of greater interest. Within these few pages, the reader is given insight into Papazolis' worldview, as well as what he understood the purpose of the Russian plot to be. Like many writers from the period, his prose alternated between language denoting a religious understanding of community and a secular, almost patriotic language. For instance, in one page from the prologue, he described the Russian Empire as the God-centered empire of Great Russia, before speaking of the glory of the Greek fatherland and then returning into a discussion about divine providence. Papazolis' tendency to alternate between religious and secular language when referring to the Russians and the Greeks reveals that he hadn't given much thought to the question of which criteria, religious affiliation, political status, etc., should be employed to individuate between the communities that he was discussing. Moreover, it was inconsequential in this context, as the Ottomans were regarded as foreign by virtue of their religion and the perception that they were foreign occupiers. Ottoman otherness was highlighted in this text through reference to the infidel Hagarenes and essentially portraying the Ottomans as these Muslim occupiers from the east. The historical narrative he constructed in the preamble to the monograph is one focused on the history of military tactics and strategy. Papazolis extolled the accomplishments of ancient Greek leaders like Themistocles and Leonidas alongside Hellenistic leaders like Philip of Macedon and Alexander the Great, before glossing over all the way to the innovations of Peter the Great. Glossing over these 2 millennia, Papazolis advanced a distinct Greco-Russian history of military strategy. While there's certainly something unfamiliar about this sort of joint Greco-Russian perspective, it must not have seemed as odd for an individual like Papazolis, who seemed equally comfortable adopting the perspective of a Russian military officer or a Greek. This is borne out in his writing, where he frequently alternated between writing from the perspective of a Russian emissary and a Greek. In one passage, Papazolis identifies himself as a Greek by claiming to direct his message towards the members of his race, the Moginis, while in another he distances himself from the Greeks, observing how the Greeks have lost their military science during the 300 years of Ottoman subjugation. That said, the narrative he constructed succeeds in conveying a specific message to its audience. While Papazolis mentions that Russia's achievements over the 18th century should be celebrated and that Ottoman tyranny must be confronted, the argument that he developed was focused on the present and was clearly articulated. He argued that a wealth of knowledge existed that the Greeks could utilize in order to redevelop their military science and advance their political goals. In fact, Papazolis made this case explicitly, suggesting that the Greeks would be wrong to attach their hopes solely on foreign powers, which up to then had been the dominant paradigm within this discourse, and that freedom would come as a result of their own efforts. The document then was very much an exhortation to the Greeks to heed the example of Peter the Great and acquire the necessary knowledge that they required in order to better their lot. The message is captured well in the following passage: "Woe to he who hopes but does not act." Ultimately, it was a message that was being directed to the members of his race. More often than not, Papazolis tended to err on the side of identifying himself as a member of the Greek community that he was addressing in this monograph. This is captured in passages like, "We are the descendants of those who lost all and suffered under the tyrannical dynasty of unjust ruling Hagarenes." While it's easy to take comments of this sort and read them as evidence of what one might term a national consciousness, such a characterization will betray the spirit of the document. In fact, Papazolis' intention seems to have been the restoration of the perceived status quo, which he saw as an Ottoman-less Europe. The Russian role in achieving this goal was to impart the necessary knowledge to the Greeks, so as to give them the push they needed to awaken them from their slumber. In Papazolis' estimation, then, the Greeks were a great people who simply lost their expertise in military science, and who needed to follow the lessons of Peter the Great if they were to return to their past grandeur. While the idea that the Greeks should seize their freedom by force may not strike the modern reader as a radical statement, it truly was a novel and radical proposition, in an era where political change could only be perceived through the resurrection and the regeneration paradigms. So, in between the writing of Papazolis' document and Catherine's proclamation, a number of different events take place. In particular, the outbreak of the Russo-Ottoman War in 1768. But prior to that, in the spring of 1768, Grigory sent his two brothers, Alexei and Theodore Orlov, to the Italian states to organize the revolt. The two adopted pseudonyms and arrived in Venice in the late summer. In the interim, Papazolis had played an integral role in establishing ties with local intermediaries. In particular, he recruited Panayotis Benakis, who was this influential merchant landowner from Kalamata who had extensive ties with merchants throughout the Greek world, stretching all the way to Amsterdam in the north and Crete in the south, and also the clans within the Peloponnese. It was Papazolis, with Benakis' help, who organized this meeting in March of 1769 at Benakis' home, at which point the leaders of the armed groups who would fight the revolt signed a proclamation for Catherine, which outlined their vision of the revolt, and which was also authored by Papazolis himself. Papazolis' hard work and Alexis' charisma helped the Russians to co-opt these local intermediaries in Venice, Tuscany, the Ionian Islands, and throughout the Ottoman Balkans, and these individuals served as the backbone of the Orlov revolt. The revolt itself finally really got organized in August and September of 1769, and the first portion of the Russian fleet left the port of Pisa en route to Mani on the 15th of November 1769, under the command of Theodore Orlov. Upon his arrival in the Peloponnese in February 1770, Theodore would circulate Catherine's proclamation, which had been authored a year prior. It's Catherine's proclamation that stands as the clearest statement of how the Russian effort to foment an anti-Ottoman revolt was being presented to the Ottoman Greeks, the Romiers. So turning now to Catherine's proclamation. The proclamation was directed towards specific communities, specifically to, quote, all the Greek and Slavic peoples of the Orthodox faith who inhabit the Balkan Peninsula or the islands of the Aegean archipelago. So we see very specific ethnic, religious, and geographic criteria being deployed at the very start of this proclamation, so that the scope of the potential uprising Catherine envisioned was very clearly defined. This was to be an uprising of the Romiers against the Ottoman Empire, and sympathetic subjects of the Venetian or Habsburg empires who wished to participate would not receive the public endorsement of the Empress. Within this proclamation, Catherine attempted to gloss over the fact that the Russians were projecting what was essentially a false unity upon the disparate communities towards which they were directing their call to arms. Accordingly, the awkward phrasing at the start of the proclamation was complemented with many of the familiar tropes encountered in the writings of Papazolis. Repeated references to the Ottoman yoke were included, and the Ottomans were repeatedly characterized as Hagarenes. Most importantly, the narrative crafted in the proclamation oriented around certain binary oppositions: Christianity versus the common enemy of Christianity, civilization versus the barbaric Turks, who, quote, scorn not only all human rights, but truth itself, and as well as freedom versus base slavery. In the view of the Empress, clear lines of religion, culture, and caste distinguished the Romi from the Ottomans, and these divisions would inevitably bring the two groups into conflict. In light of this, Catherine implored her subjugated co-religionists to seize the moment to, quote, cast off their yoke and regain their independence. While Catherine expressed her dismay over the treatment of her co-religionists repeatedly in this proclamation, she was careful not to frame the insurgency as a religious crusade. Rather, her battle was one for religious tolerance. By her estimation, Ottoman mistreatment of Orthodox Christians was only partly a consequence of, quote, the innate cruelty of the Turks and their hatred of Christianity. While Catherine suggested that this certainly informed their behavior, she also observed that the mistreatment of the Romiers was in part a response to the Russians securing freedoms for the Orthodox Christians living within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. In this narrative, the Russian Empire's motivation in the War of the Bar Confederation and the larger Russo-Ottoman conflict that emerged out of it was to defend the rights of religious minorities. Catherine's proclamation was a call to arms of sorts. It was a call to the disparate communities that made up Ottoman Europe to make common cause with one another and work towards regaining their former independence. The idea of working towards political independence was not a new idea in the Greek world. The prologue to Iossipos Misiodak's translation of the Philosophia Morale contained within it a program of cultural regeneration, which in the long term would lead to the Greeks reclaiming their independence. The idea was that if the Greeks became more educated, at a certain point they'd be capable of ruling over themselves. This in Misiodak's writings. But Catherine's proposition was slightly different, although she did depart from similar premises. Like Misiodax, as well as Voltaire, she also assumed that the qualities that distinguished the ancient Greeks continued to lay dormant in their progeny. Moreover, she also accepted Misiodak's proposition that the Romi were not quite ready for full independence. However, where she differed was in proposing an explicitly political solution to the problem. In her proclamation, Catherine did not present herself as seeking to resurrect the Byzantine Empire, nor did she limit herself to the task of restoring the Greek race to its past grandeur. Rather, her task was more focused on provoking the Romi to assert themselves politically by advancing a claim to determine their political status. Her vision was consistent with the one articulated by Papazolis nearly half a decade earlier. The Ottomans were to be ousted by force, and the Romi would regain their former grandeur under the auspices of the Russians. In Catherine's estimation, the Greeks were political agents capable of deciding whether or not to participate in a war for religious tolerance and capable of determining their own political status. By inflecting the existing Greek discourse on freedom with the idea of national self-determination, Catherine articulated a new political understanding of Greekness to those populations that received her proclamation. So to conclude then, in these two documents we see two things. One, the Russians perceived the uprising as one that would be limited to the Ottoman Balkans, in which the goal was for the Orthodox Christian communities of the region to liberate themselves against Ottoman rule by fighting alongside the Russians. And second, in advancing this message, the Russians were essentially communicating a new political understanding of Greekness, which regarded the Greeks as political agents capable of determining their own political status. In terms of the historical significance of these documents, there's two, and in the short term, there really isn't an immediate impact. And outside of arousing enthusiasm for a revolt that would ultimately fail, these documents didn't immediately influence how the Greeks saw themselves. In large part, this was because the documents could still be interpreted according to a traditional point of view. Both of the Didascalia and Catherine's proclamation could be read in a way that conformed to the popular expectation that the Greeks would be liberated by a blonde race from the north and reintegrated within an Orthodox Christian empire. However, in the medium term, what we see is that the new understanding of Greekness that the Russians cultivated in these writings came to inform the way the Greeks saw themselves in the years that followed the Treaty of Kuchik-Kanarji in 1774. So, paradoxically, this occurs as Greek culture began to abandon the traditional expectation that the Russians would liberate them, and as Greek intellectual culture was becoming more secular, increasingly turning away from the Orthodox world and turning towards Western Europe. The end of the Orlov revolt led the Russian protagonists to cultivate a new, largely recycled from travelogues, image of the Greeks as the depraved progeny of the ancients. This view was taken up by Europeans like Voltaire, Casanova, Choiseul-Gaufrier, and the view would come to be refracted through these authors into Greek culture and reflected itself in the internalization of the Western discourse on Greece's cultural degeneracy. That can be seen in the writings of Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment scholars, Katharsis, Tavaris, Misiodax, Konstantas, and Philippidis. So what? Among other things, the Orlov revolt showed us that the idea of Greek self-determination was initially a Russian idea, which only gradually made its way into Greek intellectual culture, only after being refracted through the work of increasingly influential European writers. Moreover, it also highlights the necessity of examining these shifts in collective identity through multiple chronological lenses.
Very quick one for me. Did you say Catherine said human rights?
That is what she said. There's a quote in the proclamation. I can just find it.
In the Greek version?
It's and in the English translation of the Russian. It's actually, there's an Italian version as well that I found in the British archives. Mm-hmm. But it's very much trying to narrate this event as part of the other war that's going on, which is a war for religious tolerance as it's being cast by the Russians. So, in that sense, human rights.
I have a quick comment and question. It works really well with Kitramilidis' work on the Russian expectation literature in Greek letters at the time. Now, Papazoidis is his name?
Papazolis.
Papazolis. Where is he? What is his biography about? I didn't quite catch that at the beginning.
He's originally from Macedonia. He starts off his career as a merchant trader. Fails.
Goes to Russia? What's Macedonia?
But he goes to Russia?
He travels in Thessaloniki and as far afield as the Crimea, actually. And it's there where somehow it's not immediately clear how he gets involved with the Russian armed forces. He becomes an artillery officer and develops a really strong relationship with the Orlov.
And what's his first name?
Yorgos.
And in the documents, is it Grigori or is it Yorgos?
It's Georgios.
Okay.
There is a big street named after him in Salonika.
All right.
Papazolis Street.
Papazolis.
But the modern Greeks pronounce it Papazoli. Vasily, do they say Papazolis or Papazolis?
Papazolis. Yeah.
I actually have seen it Papazolis myself.
I think in the
grammatically you're right. It doesn't make sense.
Principios, you know, we can
remember he's from Scottish, right, Vasily?
It also comes up as Papazoglu.
Papazoglu, yeah.
Yeah, sure, it's Turkified. Exactly. Yeah.
So.
Alexander, do you have questions about the name?
No, actually, I actually have a question about the main argument. I may have misunderstood. But is it that the concept of Greek political self-determination was acquired from the Russians? In other words, if what you described so well hadn't happened, there would not have been a indigenously generated or borrowed from the French Revolution concept of Greek political self-determination?
Maybe at that point, I don't want to engage in too much of a counterfactual, but my argument is that in 1770, these ideas didn't really make sense to the Greeks. So there was enough in these documents so that the Greeks could understand them and perceive them according to these traditional paradigms where they saw the Russians coming in, liberating them, and essentially joining this part to the Russian Empire. But my argument is essentially that these ideas come into Greek culture through the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment, but in part it's a refracted Russian idea, because the Russians put out the idea immediately that this revolt failed because of the Greeks. The Greeks were lazy, the Greeks were plunderers, and this idea really catches on almost immediately. You see it in the letters between Voltaire and Catherine the Great. You see it in Casanova's history of the turmoils in Poland. So within a matter of a year, 2 or 3, and you see it also in the diplomatic dispatches of a lot of the British and French diplomats who are stationed within the region. So this idea catches on. It informs the way Western Europeans look at the Greeks, and as the Greeks look away from Russia and towards the West, they're getting the refracted idea that they're internalizing through the Neo-Hellenic Enlightenment, which leads to this culture of self-contempt, which Dean Konstantaras has written about.
So, okay, just a quick follow-up, but can you then trace a connection between this to the eve of 1821, or at least the Evrydiki of 1815?
I'm not trying to. My chronology ends in 1792 because, in part, I don't want to really engage with those questions as much.
Okay, so it is an idea of political self-determination.
It's a Russian idea.
Yes, but it may not be the one that animates 1821, or is it?
No, I think at that point it becomes informed by the French Revolution, by the Vasilis.
Founded in Odessa.
By failed merchants.
Nadia.
I have a theoretical question for you, and that is that you're using stuff that sounds very post-colonial, Greek. Are you going to go there? I mean, are you going to explicitly engage the post-colonial paradigm?
Vasily, do not answer this question.
I'm just curious, because this is NYU, right? So.
Yeah.
Oh, please.
Anything you say will be held against you in a court of law.
I try to use explicit terminology. So when I mention the idea of national self-determination, this it's not the way that it's being cast by Catherine. I mean, this idea, it's a 20th century idea, essentially. But
no, I mean the internalized contempt, taking what other people see of you, internalizing it yourself, reproducing it. That.
Is Said in your footnotes?
No, I'm not really planning on engaging too much.
No, it's Greece in the footnote. That's exactly what happened.
But look, you don't need to read. You don't have to go post-colonial to make these arguments, and this is embedded in the Greek historiography, which is.
One wants to go post-colonial, but I think you should, but it doesn't need to. Actually.
It's very much in the historiography right now. I mean, written by Greeks or foreigners, and there's a straight line going all the way to the present day, sort of with the current crisis.
Absolutely.
Nico?
This is very interesting work, first of all, because it's about time someone looked at the Orlov revolt with a fresh eye. So I think that this is very, very good to begin with. Secondly, this idea about the sort of Russian origins of the political, shall we say, nation, that I say, the political entity of the Greeks. It's very intriguing also because there is, Rura has a friend who wrote a book, probably you know about this, Nasia Yakovaki, Ελλάδα μέσω Ευρώπης. And where she makes a similar argument, it seems to me, in some regards. So you may want to look at it because her Europe is Western Europe, right, Rura? It's not Russia. So I'm thinking about it. So if Nasia is right and you're right, then we actually have yet one more case in which Russia is not special, but it's very much part of Europe. So I think I'm going to create a statue to you myself if you prove this case, because finally my field is not going to be weird anymore, the way we all experienced it, right? In Europe, where we are always the odd, all joking aside, I'm serious about this, because again and again and again we find Russia participating in sort of pan-European, shall we say. Now, that leads me to my next point, which is, so in other words, I would go back to Yakovaki and look at the argument that she's making and see how it sort of goes with...
Especially since Catherine is mobilizing a lot of European...
Exactly. And also, the other thing that you need to sort of remember is you have a little bit of an issue here with Catherine herself. Catherine has absolutely no problem proclaiming whatever needs to be proclaimed to a domestic or international audience. So to Voltaire, she's writing about rights and about this and that, the other thing, and then when sort of push comes to shove, she closes down every institution that has to do with what exactly she's theoretically talking about. So I guess I would think a little bit about the idea of enlightenment as legal enlightenment, which is the way I was taught enlightenment in Russia myself, that it had a legal, sort of framework, right? Part of which you are making there, sort of the rights, right? This is definitely, you're on very good ground there, it seems to me. Enlightenment means that people have rights and that, law has to prevail, whatever that law may be. Last point that I wanted to make is, and I know you said that, you don't know, it looks like, what these ideas, what the resonance was among the Greeks themselves. Look again, maybe you will find. You're not going to get anyone say, by the way, I read Papazolis' book and I really thought it was great, for that reason. But one of the problems that we have, those of us who are working on the 18th century, and we have 3 or 4 or 5 people who say these great things, is, and who heard them and what did they get out of them. Yeah. You may find that you need to go forward a little bit in time just to ascertain this. These are just some of the suggestions that I have on. Otherwise, I think that you're going to strengthen your work and make it really. But my main point, I think, is sort of Russia. Maybe it's part of Europe here. See what I'm saying? Yeah. And yay! If it is.
Yes, I think I'm going to expand on what Nico says about Russia being part of Europe, and also.
You're not going to talk about merchants?
I have a small problem with with the way you see this subject. Yes, we do need to see the Orlov conspiracy revolution, as we say, again.
But I don't know how, and excuse me if I'm a bit hard, how fresh your approach is. I think I think you should break through a bit the Greek historiography. Now, you've talked about the Orlov revolution without taking under consideration the war that took over, that was with the Turks, without taking into consideration all the rest of the islanders that were in the fleet. You forgot the fleet there. And now it has nothing to do with my concern with the
oh, really?
Okay, no. It would have been the same if it was with an army. So you've taken that part, you've taken Papazolis, you hang him out of the ceiling, and I would want you to put it in a more political and economic context of the imperialism of Russia at that time. Okay? And also the fact that it was not only Peloponnese. You had all the Psariani, the Spetsiotes were afterwards slaughtered on the island because they united with the revolutionists, and you have a lot of privateers there as well.
And there's the base on Paros, isn't there?
And the base with Paros. So I don't. If you talk about this, then it's just you want to put it in the greater context and try to see it from apart from the Enlightenment ideological as an expansion of this empire that tries to get as much from the Ottoman as well.
Yeah, it's very much an imperial project, but at the same time there's a real disconnect between sort of the macro level where Catherine's informing the policy and passing it down to Alexei, Theodore, Papazolis on the ground who are trying to co-opt these local intermediaries. There's a real disconnect in the way that the message is communicated, but beyond that, the other thing is I see a real ending point to the Orlov revolt. And for me, the significance of the Orlov revolt is what you just said, and it's in the next chapter that I write, where I talk about it is a really widespread revolt. It extends to Lemnos, Constantinople, Thessaloniki, Crete in the south, the Ionian Islands, and it's this huge spontaneous conflagration of Orthodox Christians that allows people outside to look at it and say, oh wow, the Greek nation has just asserted itself and it's liberating itself. It's very much like it's not really perceived as these local Maniates who are following the Russians into war in anything that's written by contemporaries at the time. So for me, the significance is that you see the Greek nation essentially appear, and then you see foreigners, you see participants, you see loyalists, revolutionaries, all sort of view it in these terms, and then a few months later it's gone and it's vanished, and what you have is atrocities committed throughout Ottoman Greece, throughout the islands for the next 10 years. I mean, you have this exodus of 40,000 people from the Peloponnese in particular into the Ionian Islands, into New Russia. You have these marauding Albanian bands, and it's just decimated, but it has this sort of cultural resonance, not among the participants itself, but in this sort of literature that's written. So, I mean, I don't know if that answers the question.
Yes, but if I may be allowed to continue this and connect it with what Alexander Kitrev said about Filiki Perea. For me, this is, if you take the macro view, this revolt and the immigration then of the population in the lands really opened the route to Russia of the Greeks.
Yeah.
Okay? Which ultimately led to all these port cities, to Filiki Perea. So I think that the Orlov revolution is even more important than the Russian flag after the Kishuka treaty, because it really opened the route. Yeah. So it would be quite revolutionary in Greek historiography. Of course, it's not. This is what they've been told, and it is the prelude to the Greek Revolution. But you should do it more beyond ideas to material things. It opened, I mean, Papazoli was a merchant. I mean, merchants were very important. I mean, apart from goods, they traded ideas. Okay, and this is what happened as well in Odessa. So just just put this dimension too. I mean, people have to be contatti before they deal with ideas and revolutions. They have to be, so they have to be a bit more affluent, and it is all this affluence of some people that led or the opening of Russia.
So when you look at your shipping figures, for example, and you take us into the 1790s, and you see the tonnage rising, and you see you would connect it somehow with...
Yeah, it is completely. After the 1770s, and then the 1780s, and then the opening of Russia, and the Greeks become the main carriers, and you have not only the carriers of the sea, and you said about land, it's also with land. And you have, I didn't talk about the Nyesian Greeks that were also in the land port of Nyesian, that they dealt with all the commerce between Ottoman Empire, Russia, and Austria-Hungary. So you have the opening. I think this is the official opening and the way of immigration. I mean, in the 19th century, Russia land became the America of 20th century. Okay, this is where all thousands of Greeks immigrated. Completely great similarities, and
And part of your project has to, I mean, there's a critique of the Orlov uprisings, because traditional, I don't know how far back we're going to, traditional historiography said it was a prelude to 1821. And then there's a critique that it was either it had millenarian elements or it was clients of various people who engaged in an uprising. So you've got to, if you're going to argue what you're doing, you've got to argue against the people who are saying it's not a real revolt, it's clients or millenarian people, etc. And it's tough to do that in the 1770s. There's millenarian stuff going on until the 1840s, 50s in Greece. So you've got to kind of establish the credentials of the Orlov rebellion as a rebellion.
Well, some of what you're what you'll be doing in your later chapters, we'll get into some of these things. But I think the comments of the colleagues here, which are very opportune. You're young and impressionable, and you're still writing. So it's a perfect time to listen to these things. But there is this material foundation. There is this material, and of course the critique of Rodzokos. I don't know what's happened to that. Do you remember the?
Rodzokos is in the introduction.
He's in the introduction. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's not presenting his whole thesis.
Yeah. I want all of it, and I want it now.
The bigger project is what?
The biggest project is ideas of Greekness in this period.
Do you know Nikolaos' thesis?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. Because Nikolaos also speaks about this mixture of millenarian and innovative elements, right?
Yeah.
And he starts looking at it in the time of Peter the Great, as well.
There is this trajectory. There is this influence. But what I found in the primary sources is that it's been somewhat overstated, I think. And a lot more is just the client networks that are established.
Are you in touch with Nikos directly?
No, I've just read it.
I can put you in touch with Nikos. He's a very nice guy. He's going to help you.
Oh, wonderful.
So,
Right. Well, so we wish you well with the rest of this. Keep working hard. And I wanted to thank everybody. Good things happen when we mix up the categories and we put in together people who naturally do not belong together. So in this unnatural field, we come up with interesting conversations. Thank you, Liana, for helping make this possible. We should do much more.
Thank you, Liana.
And thank you, Fiona, for... Thank you, Fiona.
And thank you for not taping me.
It's already...